I was born in Shanghai, China. My parents were political prisoners. They were arrested by Soviet government. They both were British citizens.
It would be best for me to describe the kind of person that I was back in those days. And you probably would have described me as a hedonistic, materialistic nightclub owner.
I was born and raised in a suburb of Massachusetts in a middle-class environment. My dad had gone into the Navy during World War II, and his Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best were two of the popular shows on TV, which bore absolutely no resemblance to the reality that we were all experiencing.
I was born in a cargo of railroad which was merchandising or taking merchandise from China to Soviet Union and from Soviet Union to China. My parents worked on Trans-Siberian Railroad, and there was a little city which was called Kushka, and that's where they were going from there to China.
Although I had been raised Catholic, I was probably an atheist. I didn't believe in an afterlife. My idea of life was he who dies with the most toys wins.
So we went to church on Sunday. I got dressed up like a little man with a suit and a bow tie and a hat. My sisters all had white gloves and pretty hats and matching outfits that my mother made for her, and there was this whole parade of going to church and being all dressed up, and we all sat there like the ideal American family. And then church would get over and we'd get into the car. Then they'd be yelling and screaming and slapping and hitting and crying, and and church seemed like this ideal that was far removed from the reality.
I was born, of course, in Gulag. That was Gulag's part of what they worked for, so I wasn't allowed to be. They put me in a wooden suitcase with the holes, and that's how they traveled back to their Gulag. But then a decree came in 1956 of Nikita Khrushchev, and they were allowed to go back to their respectful countries. But my parents were killed when I was 7 months old. I was adopted by their friends and taken to Georgia. They gave me incredible love and care, and I had everything I needed as a child, and I never knew I was adopted.
I had two highly successful nightclubs, Club Marrakesh in the Hamptons, in a fashionable summer resort area of eastern Long Island in New York, and Club Marrakesh in Palm Beach, Florida. I had a luxury home in the Hamptons and apartments in Palm Beach and New York City. I drove a Mercedes-Benz convertible. Otherwise, I traveled by private jet, seaplane, helicopter, and limousine.
It was beginning to be real disillusioned with the church because of the difference between the ideals of the church and what I soon came to identify as the hypocrisy of the church and the reality of what people really lived and did. And so I, along with tens of millions of people my age, became disillusioned with America, the government, society, church, and everything else, and went our own ways.
My parents had a lot of books. I had 5,000 books at home, so I read a lot. I was a little bit different than any other children because I mostly loved to be in my fantasy world, in a book world, and I read a lot, and then my intellect developed differently. I went to research myself several books and writings and linguistics, and I began to learn 2 languages, and this happiness was cut by the death of my father.
I dined in the finest restaurants with celebrities and sports personalities. I had all the money, the power, the prestige that a single guy in his 30s could even dream about. And I really thought I had it made living in that fast lane.
With the death of John Kennedy in '63, and then the subsequent death of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, it seemed like what we needed to do was to build an alternative society. So my wife and I got married in '65, and we went out to San Francisco in '66, lived out there. And we believed that we were creating a new society. We believed we were, quote, realists. And part of that realism was we didn't believe in supernatural things. We didn't believe in religion. We didn't believe in God.
So I was 13 when I was encountered with the KGB. I was arrested because I wrote a poem against government. So after arrest, and I was beaten severely, I wrote a confession and letter to government saying that I will never, ever, ever write any poems against government anymore. So I haven't. I wrote only essays. One of them became pretty much well known, and the Moscow University president invited me for talk. And he suggested me to become a student of Moscow University while I was not yet even 14.
You see, when I was about 5 years old, my mother and I had to flee the apartment that we were living in with my dad. My sister, who was several years older, was already living in my grandmother's home. And the reason she was living there was because of my dad's drinking and his violence. And one night, my dad's violence during one of his drinking bouts got so bad, and he was so abusive, physically abusive to my mother, he actually threw her down a flight of stairs, and I went with her to the bottom of the stairs. And I can remember, as a little 5-year-old boy, actually trying to jump out of my skin to try to stop this event from happening. Well, that was the last night for my mother. We fled the apartment that night, but of course I was his son, so I would seek my dad out for many years thereafter.
What I wanted to do was to be an artist and art teacher, so I finished my graduate studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Did a year in New Mexico on a grant, which was wonderful. I love New Mexico. And then got an offer to be part of starting an art program at a university in Kentucky, at a school that had just started, and that seemed like a real sort of pioneering thing, because I imagined Kentucky was like log cabins and horse farms and things like that. To my great surprise, there weren't any log cabins or horse farms in the area that I moved into, but became a careerist, a hedonist, a careerist, a materialist.
So I had 7 months to go and study and have tutoring and then have examinations in every subject of high school. And in 7 months I graduated and I became the youngest student of Moscow University. I began to study philosophy, but it was pretty much boring, and I asked to move to medical school. I became a student of medical school when I was 14, and I graduated when I was 19. I got my first PhD when I was 22.